Here is Montegrappa Harry Potter Ravenclaw, a blue ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
Is intentional. If you like turquoise or blue blacks or very dark blues, if you like Harry Potter, like the A-Team, if you can find it, you should get it. This is a fun blue, sometimes turquoise, sometimes blue black, that I indeed enjoyed using, and it's very eye-catching. All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with a fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
The pen for today is a Mnemosyne Singularity.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the extra fine nib, we get a very nice blue with no feathering, with no spread, with some pretty decent shading throughout most everything here. I'm gonna point out imprisonment on the third line, where the I is darker than the M. The PR darken up a little bit. It lightens into the IS. ON gets darker. M lightens up a little bit, and then it works its way gradually darker all the way to the T. Very nicely done. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, though it does show off a little bit more of the darker tones more frequently. It's the same tone with no feathering, with no spread, still with a very good shading. Look at Racket on the third line. The RA is a nice mid-tone. The C darkens up, lightens up into the K where it starts to get darker again, very dark at the ET at the end. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium and the extra fine. Here again, showing off more of the darker tones than it did in the medium, though the writing is really the same tone. No feather, no spread, shading just as well as it did with the medium and the extra fine. I have to say, going through all of this, you can easily find your lighter and darker letters on all of the nibs. This is really a very interesting ink. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 3 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. Though, what we have here is, instead of it being a darker blue, it's like a darker turquoise with a slight blue lean towards it. No feather, no spread, shades, I think just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. No problem finding lighter or darker letters within words or words in there entirely, like Mary making on the third line, where Mary is mostly a lighter word. The Y gets quite a bit darker. In making, the MA is darker, but it's the king, or lighter, but the king at the end gets much darker. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We still have that it's kind of a turquoise leaning blue opposed to a dark blue. Very nice dark looking turquoise on this paper. It does shade regularly with no problem. I don't think you can find a word that doesn't have both lighter and darker tones in it, except for came on the first line. That's all one tone. Other than that, everything shows very nice shading. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. we get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get shading. Take a look at Sellers on the second line, where the C is a lighter tone, the E gets quite a bit darker. The first L lightens up, second L dark, lightens into the AR, and very dark at the S at the end. And this is common throughout all of the writing done with this nib on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue our notes back here if we were to choose to.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, though it is certainly green here. So this is a more translucent ink. It's really being affected of the tone of the paper, but we find with the non-fountain pen-friendly papers, it goes through a tone shift anyway. But boy, it is green here. No feather, no spread. Yes, it shades just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. I'm going to say as a green on this paper, because that's how it looks, it is still a very interesting green. Man, I wish this is something that was like, we did this on purpose, and look at how interesting it is and how it changes on different papers, because this ink does it very nicely. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine. A little bit lighter in darkness compared to the Clairfontaine. Definitely a green, not a blue as we see it on this paper. No feathering, no spread. It shades without a problem. After all, it's a pretty good ink. Take a look at after on the third line. The A is lighter than the F, and the T gets a bit darker still into the E, and it's the R that starts to lighten up some. Whatever it is you would be after, this ink does have it. Take a look at whatever on the second line, where the W is lighter, the H darkens up, the A light, the TE dark, the V lighter, the E a nice mid-tone, the R even darker again. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. Definitely green, not blue. Result of the paper, nothing wrong with this ink or your screen. No feathering, no spread. Yes, it shades just as well. The only thing to keep in mind if you really want to use this paper with this ink is it's going to be green and not blue. But it's a beautiful green at that, so no loss. Looking at the back of the page, now on the stub, it did get quite deep into the paper in just one or two spots, but nothing bled through touching the page underneath. I think you could easily write on the back of the page, especially with the extra fine or the medium.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left. Pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get shading without any kind of problem. Take a look. It started grumbling on the third line. The S is a nice mid-tone where the TAR get a bit darker. The next T lightens up a little bit through the E, and it's the up and downstroke of the D that gets darker again. Even grumbling starts a little lighter with the G. The R is darker than the letters that surround it because the UM lighten up. The BL do get darker. It's the ing at the end that gets much darker even still. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. I didn't talk about it with the extra fine. We're going to talk about the quad rule here. Not a problem. It just disappears into the background as you go to read. So fantastic. Shading, yes please, it's definitely there, and it's not drowning. Take a look at drowned on the second line. Where the DR are lighter, it's the O into the W that darken up a little bit. The rest of the W into the N stay light. It's the ED at the end that get dark again. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. It is still showing off much more of the darker tones, but still being that same tone. So you really take a look at Notion on the first line, where the N-O-T, well, the whole word is a bit darker. The 2 underneath it, the T is a little lighter than the O. Again, really showing off lighter tones. Moving down to the third line, take a look at this, where you get a nice lighter T. The hump of the H is darker than the rest of the H. The I is lighter, and the end of the S is much darker. Same tones, though, again, we're seeing much more of the darker side of it more frequently. Looking at the back of the page, with no surprises that there's no bleeding and no ghosting. No ghosting at all. It's as if I didn't even write on the other side of the page.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Califolio Omi Osun. Here is Diamine Mediterranean Blue. Here is Geherban Blue Azure. Here is Noodler's Navy.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, though we are definitely seeing this as a green leaning turquoise. Maybe teal, whatever, we'll call it with the turquoise. It's definitely showing off the green much more than the blue here. I wouldn't have considered this a blue if this was the only paper I was using it. I'd have thought it was green and been, confused by the name. Not because of the ink, it's because of its reaction with the paper. No feather, no spread. Shading, yes, not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but still shading very well. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine. A little bit, I want to say it looks a little bit lighter than the Clairfontaine, even though I know those were the same tone there. The green makes it appear a little lighter on the page, although the darkness is probably about the same because it's the same tone as the extra fine. No feather, no spread. I think the shading shows off a little better here than it did on the extra fine, just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Really not a problem. Look at Don't Suppose on the first line. The D and the T of don't are a little bit darker than the rest of the word. Now suppose starts lighter on the su at the beginning, but the p in the middle are quite a bit darker. It lightens up at the OS and the E at the end quite a bit darker. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, same tone as the Clairfontaine, still being green over being a blue result of the paper. No feather, no spread, shading, not impossible at all. Look at impossible on the fourth line. The IM are lighter than the P, which is very dark. The ASI in the middle, much lighter. The B is a nice midtone. The LE at the end, very dark. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting. Have no fear continuing your notes on this side.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Sailor Sakura Mori. Here is Diamine Blaze Orange. Here is Monteverde Napa Burgundy. Here is Krishna Yellow Valley.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. It feathers like a monster. It spreads, not horribly, but almost up to a medium. So yeah, it spreads. Would I want to use this? I'm skipping talking about shading. This is gross on the page. Don't do it. Leave it in the yuck column. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine with a very slight green lean to it. Yes, it feathers. Yes, it spreads. oddly, it's not feathering as badly as it did on the Extra Fine. The Extra Fine was really distracting. Here I have areas that the feathering is very distracting, like again on the second line, or Hobbit, the bit at the end on the third line. It spreads about up to, just under a broad, I would say. Still going to leave it in the gross. I wouldn't use it. I don't even want to talk about whether shading's there because this is ugh. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. Same tones darkness-wise as the Clairfontaine, definitely being a green over a blue in this case. It feathers horribly. It spreads, yes. It's the feathering and the spreading that always, for this, make it a make or break when I'm looking at the front of the page. Past, on the first line, the amount of feathering that's going through this, like through on the second line, I'd pass this through to a different paper. I would not use this here. It is just, it's been gross the entire time. Looking at the back of the page, gross performance on the front aside, the ink gets very deep into the paper, which makes it very obvious why it spread and feathered so much. None of this, though, surprisingly, touched the page underneath, so you're not ruining 2 sheets of paper with it, but you definitely can't write back here.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
All the pens in the writing look the same as far as the color goes, and even the shading. And it's great shading. We can say that there is more presence of the darker tones as the nibs get larger or as they would get wetter, but on the majority we have the same tone. So the choice is obviously on the dealer here to ink up their favorite pen and go and enjoy it, if, of course, you can get your hands on this ink.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.